The revolver never left his reach, even in sleep. Jesse James checked the windows 7 times each night, his hands trembling as he drew the curtains. His wife learned to wake him from across the room, never by touch. Newspapers called him the most fearless outlaw in America. But fear had a way of wearing a man's face into something unrecognizable, even to himself. Was Jesse James the master of his legend, or its prisoner? Quick truth. My history professor once told me nobody cares about the stories that didn't make the textbooks. That these forgotten voices would stay buried because people want their history safe and sanitized. I started this channel to prove him wrong, and thousands of you have done exactly that. But digging through archives and finding these lost stories takes real time. So if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, hit that like button and subscribe. And if you can, the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description helps me spend more time researching and less time worrying about bills. Shout out to Jorge, who just bought me a coffee. You're helping preserve history, one forgotten story at a time. Now, back to this story. Legends are easier to build than to live inside. By 1876, Jesse James had become American mythology in human form. The newspapers painted him in ink and awe. The daring bank robber who walked into Missouri institutions in broad daylight. The train bandit who somehow always stayed 3 steps ahead of the law. The Confederate guerrilla turned outlaw who never apologized for the war he'd fought. Dime novels transformed his robberies into acts of rebellion, his violence into righteousness. He was the man who refused to surrender, even after the South had fallen, who took from northern banks what he believed they'd stolen from southern soil. The public consumed the legend hungrily. They wanted the man without fear, without doubt, without the trembling hands that betrayed what war had actually done. But legends have a way of crumbling when you look at them in lamplight. The Kansas City Journal ran a profile in 1873 that mentioned details the dime novels never included. Jesse James, the article noted, seemed to require very little sleep. What the reporter framed as stamina was something else entirely. Associates described a man who paced through the small hours, who startled at sounds no one else heard, who kept weapons within arm's reach even when eating supper. His brother Frank once told a journalist that Jesse hadn't slept a full night since the war ended, though the comment was buried in the back pages, where mythology doesn't reach. Sleep, when it came, brought no rest. His wife, Zerelda, learned to recognize the signs. The way his breathing would quicken in darkness. The sudden movements, hands reaching for guns that weren't there. The screaming that woke the household but never woke Jesse himself. She took to sleeping in a separate room, not from lack of affection, but from the practical recognition that touching him during nightmares could prove dangerous. She told a cousin in a letter preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives that sometimes she barely recognized the man she'd married, that he seemed to be fighting battles no one else could see. The public knew Jesse James as fearless. Those who lived with him knew him as a man perpetually braced for attack. Trust became impossible. Gang members noted his paranoia, the way he'd insist on checking doors and windows repeatedly, the violent outbursts when someone approached from behind without warning. He moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough for the ghosts to find him. Or perhaps it was the law he feared. The difference, for Jesse James, had become impossible to distinguish. Newspaper accounts from the period reveal patterns that editors treated as quirks of personality rather than symptoms of something larger. The Kansas City Times mentioned his nervous disposition. The St. Louis Dispatch noted his mercurial temperament. A profile in the Liberty Tribune described mood swings so severe that associates never knew which Jesse James would appear, the charming raconteur or the man who'd pull a weapon at an unexpected sound. What they were documenting, without the language to name it, was a man coming apart. The violence that made Jesse James famous wasn't just criminal enterprise, it was continuation. The war had ended in April of 1865, but for Jesse, surrender had never truly arrived. The bank robberies used guerrilla tactics. The train heists followed cavalry raid patterns. The careful planning and sudden explosive action mirrored every ambush he'd ridden with Quantrill's raiders. He hadn't stopped fighting. He'd simply changed uniforms and targets. But here was the question that nobody asked in 1876, the question that undermines every heroic myth built around his name. How did a teenage guerrilla fighter become not just an outlaw, but a man perpetually at war with invisible enemies? The answer lived in the space between legend and lamplight, in the trembling hands that checked windows 7 times each night, in the sleep that brought only terror, in the trust that became impossible. Jesse James was haunted. History would take more than a century to understand by what. 15 is the age when most boys were still learning their father's trade. Jesse James was 15 years old in the spring of 1864 when he joined Quantrill's Raiders, a guerrilla unit operating along the Missouri-Kansas border. While other teenagers apprenticed as blacksmiths or farmhands, Jesse learned a different kind of craft entirely. The skills that would define the rest of his life, the instincts that would eventually destroy him, were forged in a type of warfare that had no front lines, no uniforms, and no mercy. This wasn't the war taught in school textbooks. There were no grand battles with clear sides and honorable codes. This was warfare reduced to its most intimate and brutal form. Guerrilla combat in Civil War Missouri operated by rules that weren't rules at all. William Quantrill's Raiders fought for the Confederacy, but the Confederate Army often disavowed them. They wore no standard uniforms, though some accounts describe them in captured Union blues, or civilian clothes that made every stranger a potential enemy. They struck without warning and vanished before organized forces could respond. The line between soldier and civilian blurred until it disappeared entirely. Historical records from the Missouri State Archives document the nature of this conflict. It was neighbor against neighbor, farm against farm, personal grudges wrapped in political causes until no one could separate revenge from ideology. Union sympathizers in Missouri called it terrorism. Confederate supporters called it resistance. Jesse James, at 15, learned to call it survival. The warfare itself was designed to create exactly the kind of damage that would haunt him decades later. Psychological research conducted in the late 20th century on combat trauma identified specific factors that increase the likelihood of lasting psychological injury. Guerrilla warfare in Civil War Missouri contained nearly all of them. First, there was the absence of clear front lines. Conventional soldiers knew when they were in combat zones and when they were safe behind their own lines. Guerrilla fighters like Jesse had no such certainty. Every moment required vigilance. Every road could hide an ambush. Every farmhouse might shelter enemies. Sleep became a tactical decision rather than a natural rhythm, snatched in brief periods with weapons always within reach. Second, the age at which exposure began. Modern neuroscience has shown that adolescent brains are still developing, particularly in areas that process fear, regulate emotion, and assess threat. Combat exposure during these formative years doesn't just create memories. It shapes the very architecture of how the brain responds to the world. Jesse James entered guerrilla warfare while his nervous system was still learning how to function. Violence became the foundation on which everything else was built. Third, the intimate nature of the conflict. Quantrill's raiders conducted operations that brought them face to face with their targets. Historical accounts from the period describe raids where combatants could see each other's expressions, hear each other's voices. This proximity created a different kind of psychological impact than artillery fire from distant positions. The human mind struggles to process violence at such close range, especially when that violence extends beyond opposing soldiers to the communities that sheltered them. The Kansas City Journal documented numerous raids throughout 1864 and 1865. The accounts, written by witnesses on both sides, describe the psychological toll. Young guerrilla fighters aged visibly over months. Their letters home, preserved in various historical societies, reveal increasing disconnection from civilian life. They wrote about struggling to remember what peace felt like, about nightmares that followed them even in daylight, about a constant state of readiness that made rest impossible. Jesse James spent his formative teenage years in this environment. While other boys his age learned trades that would support families, Jesse learned to read landscapes for ambush points. While they learned to trust their communities, he learned that anyone might betray his location to Union forces. While they slept soundly, he developed the habit of sleeping lightly with weapons close, a habit that newspaper accounts 3 decades later would note he never broke. The historical record shows that Quantrill's raiders operated primarily at night. Darkness provided concealment, but it also meant living in a state of heightened anxiety where every sound could signal danger. Jesse learned to move silently, to trust his instincts over his reasoning, to react with violence before assessing whether violence was necessary. These weren't character flaws. They were survival skills essential to staying alive in a war where hesitation meant death. By the time the Confederacy surrendered in April of 1865, Jesse James had spent 2 years in constant combat. He was 17 years old. He'd lived through experiences that military psychiatrists wouldn't fully understand for another century. The teenage years, when most young men were still discovering who they might become, Jesse James had learned exactly one thing with absolute certainty: how to survive by never feeling safe. The war would officially end, but the nervous system doesn't recognize official declarations. The instincts that kept Jesse alive in 1864 would become the symptoms that made peace impossible in 1876. The hypervigilance was necessary then would look like paranoia later. The quick violence that was survival would become the outlaw legend. He carried the war inside him, and it would never truly surrender. Time moves differently when every shadow might kill you. Days in Quantrill's raiders didn't follow the rhythms of ordinary life. There was no dawn reveille, no organized camp, no supply lines bringing regular meals. Instead, there were long stretches of waiting, punctuated by moments of action so intense they compressed hours into heartbeats. Jesse James and his fellow guerrillas lived in the spaces between civilization and wilderness, never fully part of either, always alert to the possibility that the next moment might require violence or flight. The psychological literature on combat stress identifies waiting as one of the most damaging aspects of warfare. The human nervous system can handle brief periods of acute threat. What destroys it is prolonged uncertainty, the constant activation of fear, responses with no clear resolution. Guerrilla fighters in Civil War Missouri existed in exactly this state for months or years at a time. Historical records from the period paint a picture of this existence. Quantrill's raiders moved constantly through the Missouri and Kansas border regions, sleeping in barns, caves, and sympathetic households. They couldn't build fires that might give away their positions. They couldn't gather in large groups that would make them visible to Union patrols. They developed a culture of perpetual readiness, where relaxation became dangerous. Letters preserved in the Kansas State Historical Society describe the psychological toll. One young guerrilla wrote to his sister in 1864 that he couldn't remember what it felt like to be unafraid. Another mentioned in his diary that he'd started flinching at sounds that used to seem normal. A door closing, footsteps on wooden floors, horses in the distance. These weren't weak men. They were men whose nervous systems were learning patterns that would persist long after the threats had ended. The nights were worse. Guerrilla operations happened primarily in darkness, when movement could be concealed. Jesse James learned to navigate by starlight, to distinguish between the sound of Union cavalry and farmers returning home, to wake instantly from shallow sleep when something in the environment changed. Sleep deprivation became chronic. The medical understanding of 1864 couldn't explain why men who seemed physically healthy would develop tremors, racing heartbeats, and difficulty concentrating. Modern neuroscience recognizes these as the effects of sustained sleep disruption on a developing brain. Then there was the moral weight of what guerrilla warfare demanded. Unlike conventional soldiers who fought other soldiers on battlefields, Quantrill's raiders operated in civilian areas where the categories of combatant and non-combatant blurred beyond recognition. Union sympathizers in Missouri sometimes sheltered federal troops. Confederate sympathizers sometimes betrayed guerrilla positions. Trust became impossible because betrayal could come from anyone. The raids themselves created lasting psychological damage in ways that conventional combat often didn't. When you fight at a distance, the enemy remains abstract. When you conduct operations in homes and towns, when you see the faces of people affected by violence, the human cost becomes impossible to ignore. Military psychiatrists studying combat trauma in the 20th century found that proximity to civilian suffering created what they termed moral injury, psychological damage that comes not from fear of death, but from participating in actions that violate one's core values. Jesse James carried this particular burden. Historical accounts suggest he struggled with the civilian nature of guerrilla warfare, even while participating in it. A letter written by a fellow raider and preserved in the Missouri Historical Society mentions Jesse's increasing withdrawal, his reluctance to speak about operations, his habit of drinking heavily after raids. These patterns would intensify over the years. The guerrilla culture also rewarded exactly the behaviors that would later make peaceful life impossible. Paranoia kept you alive when trust could get you hanged. Quick violence meant you survived ambushes that killed those who hesitated. Emotional detachment protected you from processing the full weight of what you witnessed and participated in. Jesse James became excellent at guerrilla warfare precisely because he developed the psychological patterns that would later destroy his ability to function in peacetime. By 1865, Jesse had spent 2 years in this environment. His adolescent brain had wired itself around constant threat assessment, hypervigilance, and the suppression of emotional responses that might interfere with survival. Contemporary accounts describe him as having changed dramatically from the boy who'd first joined the raiders. He spoke less, trusted no one completely, reacted to unexpected stimuli with immediate aggression. These weren't personality changes. They were adaptive responses to an environment where different behaviors would have meant death. The tragedy was that the environment would end, but the adaptations would persist. The human nervous system learns from experience. Jesse James's nervous system learned that the world was fundamentally dangerous, that trust was fatal, that violence was the appropriate response to uncertainty. It learned these lessons so thoroughly that unlearning them would prove impossible. When the war finally ended in April of 1865, Jesse James was 17 years old. He'd spent his formative years becoming exactly the kind of person who could survive guerrilla warfare. The problem was what that survival would cost him for the rest of his life. The Confederacy surrendered in April of 1865, but nobody told Jesse James's body. He returned to Clay County, Missouri in May of that year, expecting to find home. What he found instead was a landscape that had been systematically destroyed by 4 years of neighbor fighting neighbor. The James family farm showed the scars. Fields burned during raids, the house damaged by Union militia searching for guerrillas, family graves that marked the cost of choosing the wrong side in a brother's war. His stepfather had been beaten and nearly hanged by federal forces trying to extract information about Jesse's whereabouts. The community he'd known as a child had fractured into hostile camps where yesterday's friends were today's informants. For Union veterans returning from the war, there was a path forward. The federal government established pension systems, provided medical care, honored their service. They could speak openly about their experiences, gather at veteran reunions, build fraternal organizations that helped them process what they'd endured. The national narrative welcomed them as heroes. Confederate guerrillas received no such consideration. General Order No. 11, issued in 1863, had already expelled thousands of Missouri civilians from border counties suspected of supporting guerrillas. After the war ended, federal authorities offered limited amnesty to regular Confederate soldiers, but specifically excluded guerrilla fighters. Men like Jesse James were considered outlaws rather than soldiers, their wartime actions classified as criminal rather than military. Returning home meant risking arrest, trial, and execution. The psychological impact of this exclusion cannot be overstated. Modern trauma research has identified social support and community recognition as crucial factors in recovery from combat stress. Confederate guerrillas were denied both. They couldn't speak about their experiences without risking prosecution. They received no medical care, symptoms that were already beginning to manifest. They were told, effectively, that their suffering didn't count because their cause had been wrong. Jesse James, at 17, found himself trapped between a past that could get him hanged and a future that seemed impossible to imagine. The skills that had kept him alive during the war had no peacetime application. The hypervigilance, the quick violence, the inability to trust were liabilities rather than assets. But the nervous system doesn't simply shut off adaptations because circumstances change. This was when doctors first began documenting what they called soldier's heart. The medical literature from the mid-1860s reveals physicians struggling to understand a pattern of symptoms appearing in veterans across both sides of the conflict. The condition was characterized by a racing heartbeat that seemed to have no physical cause, chronic insomnia, night terrors, sudden startle responses, and tremors that came and went without explanation. Dr. Jacob Mendez da Costa, a Philadelphia physician, published detailed observations in 1867 describing what he termed irritable heart. His clinical notes, preserved in the College of Physicians of Philadelphia archives, document symptoms that modern readers would immediately recognize. Patients whose hearts raced at unexpected sounds, who couldn't sleep despite exhaustion, who experienced what they described as reliving battlefield experiences in vivid detail. Da Costa attributed the condition to physical strain on the heart muscle during combat. He wasn't wrong that something physical was happening, but he was looking at the wrong organ. The damage was neurological, not cardiac. Other physicians used different terminology for similar observations. Melancholia described the emotional numbness and withdrawal many veterans displayed. Nostalgia referred to a kind of homesickness that left soldiers unable to function even after returning home. Moral insanity was applied to veterans who engaged in violence or erratic behavior that seemed out of character with their pre-war personalities. The medical establishment of the 1860s knew something was profoundly wrong with many combat veterans. They documented the symptoms carefully, proposed various treatments, and recognized that the condition could persist for years after combat ended. What they lacked was the theoretical framework to understand that they were observing psychological trauma rather than physical disease. Jesse James displayed every symptom physicians were documenting as soldier's heart, though there's no evidence he ever sought medical treatment. The racing pulse, the insomnia, the nightmares, the emotional volatility were all noted by those who knew him. But seeking help would have meant admitting he was a Confederate guerrilla, which would have meant arrest. So the symptoms went untreated, reinforced by an environment that offered no safe space for healing. The war had ended on paper. In Jesse James's nervous system, in the racing of his heart at unexpected sounds, in the nightmares that made sleep a battlefield, the war continued without pause. And the medical establishment, watching veterans struggle with invisible wounds, could only document the symptoms while the suffering persisted. They knew something was broken. They just couldn't see where the fracture lived. The frontier didn't ask questions about what haunted you, only whether you could shoot straight. Jesse James moved westward in 1866, following a pattern that thousands of other Confederate veterans would repeat in the years after the war. The American frontier in the late 1860s wasn't the heroic landscape of later mythology. It was a place where men with violent pasts could disappear into new identities, where legal authority remained thin enough that yesterday's crimes didn't always follow you, where the very instability that made civilian life unbearable became an asset rather than a liability. The first documented James gang robbery occurred in February of 1866, less than a year after the war's end. The Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri, was held up by a group of men whose tactics were immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with guerrilla warfare. They struck in daylight, used overwhelming numbers, executed a precision plan that suggested military training, and vanished before organized pursuit could form. Witnesses noted the raiders' comfort with violence, their coordination, their lack of hesitation. What newspapers described as criminal audacity was actually something else entirely. Jesse James hadn't become an outlaw. He'd simply continued being a guerrilla fighter with different targets. The transition required no transformation because the psychological patterns were identical. Assess the target, plan the approach, execute with speed and violence, escape before superior forces could respond. These were the same tactics that had kept him alive during the war. Now they made him famous. The frontier economy of the late 1860s created an environment where Jesse's damaged psychology wasn't just tolerated, but actively rewarded. In established eastern cities, his paranoia would have seemed pathological. His inability to trust would have isolated him. His quick violence would have led to arrest. But in the barely governed territories of the post-war West, these same traits were survival skills. Towns settled disputes through shootouts rather than courts. Vigilante justice operated faster than legal processes. Reputation for violence provided protection that law enforcement couldn't. The hypervigilance that made Jesse unable to relax in peacetime was exactly what kept outlaws alive when enemies could appear from any direction. The emotional detachment that destroyed his personal relationships made it easier to ride away from communities before attachments formed. Modern psychology recognizes this pattern as environmental reinforcement of trauma symptoms. When behaviors that stem from psychological damage are rewarded rather than challenged, they don't heal. They intensify. Jesse James didn't recover from war trauma by moving west. He found an environment that made recovery unnecessary by rewarding the very symptoms that peace would have required him to overcome. The alcohol came next. Accounts from the 1870s describe Jesse's increasing reliance on whiskey, particularly after robberies or during the long stretches between jobs. Self-medication with alcohol is one of the most common responses to untreated trauma, a way to temporarily quiet the racing thoughts, dull the hypervigilance, make sleep possible even when nightmares wait. The Kansas City Times mentioned his drinking in 1873, noting that associates had observed him consuming significant quantities without apparent intoxication, a tolerance that suggests chronic use. Gambling served a similar function. The poker games, the bets on horse races, the constant financial risk-taking, all created artificial stakes that mimicked the life-or-death decisions of guerrilla warfare. Trauma survivors often engage in high-risk behaviors not because they're seeking thrills, but because ordinary life feels unbearably flat after prolonged exposure to extreme stress. Jesse James's nervous system had calibrated itself to constant danger. Gambling recreated that intensity in a controlled form. The gang itself became a substitute for the guerrilla unit, reproducing the same social structure and psychological dynamics. There was the same hierarchy, the same codes of loyalty, the same us versus them mentality that made trust possible within the group while remaining impossible outside it. Jesse surrounded himself with other former guerrillas, men who understood the language of violence and suspicion because they'd learned it in the same war. They didn't question each other's nightmares or paranoia because they shared them. What they created wasn't a criminal enterprise in the modern sense. It was a continuation of guerrilla warfare by other means, staffed by men whose nervous systems couldn't adjust to peace because the frontier offered an alternative. Keep fighting, keep moving, keep the adrenaline high enough that you don't have to feel what's underneath. The Old West didn't heal Jesse James's war trauma. It provided an environment where healing wasn't necessary, where the symptoms could be reframed as strengths, where broken men could become legends simply by continuing to do what war had taught them. But there's a cost to never healing. The alcohol tolerance builds. The risks must escalate to produce the same effect. The isolation deepens. The violence becomes the only language you speak fluently. Jesse James rode west looking for escape. What he found was a place that would let him run from himself until running became the only thing he knew how to do. Your nervous system remembers what your conscious mind tries to forget. By the early 1870s, Jesse James had become two different men occupying the same body. There was the public figure, the outlaw whose exploits filled newspaper columns and dime novels. Then there was the private man, the one his family and closest associates knew, whose behavior grew increasingly erratic as the years distanced him from the war that had shaped him. The symptoms were always there, documented in letters, newspaper observations, and testimony from those who lived with the consequences of his unraveling. The nightmares came first, or perhaps they'd never left. Zerelda James, his wife, described them in a letter to her sister preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives. She wrote that Jesse would wake screaming, reaching for weapons that weren't there, his eyes open, but seeing something no one else could see. Sometimes he'd be halfway across the real room before consciousness returned, before he remembered that the war had ended years ago. She learned to sleep in separate quarters, not from lack of affection, but from the practical recognition that touching him during these episodes could trigger violence. Modern sleep research has documented how trauma affects the sleeping brain. The nightmares aren't simple bad dreams, but intrusive re-experiencing, the mind attempting to process events it couldn't fully comprehend at the time. The brain doesn't distinguish between remembered trauma and present danger. Jesse's nervous system, encountering these memories in sleep, responded as though the threats were immediate. The sweating, the racing heart, the reaching for weapons were all appropriate responses to dangers that existed only in his neural pathways. The paranoia intensified with each passing year. Gang members noted Jesse's insistence on checking rooms before entering, his refusal to sit with his back to doors or windows, his violent reactions when approached unexpectedly. The Liberty Tribune published an account in 1874 describing how Jesse had pulled a weapon on a friend who'd clapped him on the shoulder in greeting. The friend, himself a former guerrilla, understood immediately and backed away with hands raised. Someone without that shared context might not have survived the moment. This wasn't personality quirk or criminal caution. Clinical psychology now recognizes this as hypervigilance, a state where the threat detection system becomes permanently activated. Jesse's brain had learned during the war that relaxing attention meant death. It never unlearned the lesson. Every shadow held potential ambush. Every stranger might be an informant. Every unexpected sound required immediate defensive response. The cognitive load of maintaining this constant vigilance was exhausting, but the alternative felt like suicide. The violent outbursts came without warning. Newspaper accounts from the mid-1870s describe instances where Jesse would explode in rage over minor provocations. A perceived slight, a question he interpreted as challenging, an unexpected noise. Frank James, his brother and fellow gang member, told a reporter years later that you never knew which Jesse would appear, the charming storyteller or the man whose anger could erupt like a thunderstorm. Modern trauma research calls this emotional dysregulation, the inability to modulate responses appropriately to the situation. Jesse's nervous system existed in a state of constant low-level activation, always ready for threat. When anything pushed that activation higher, there was no gradual escalation. It was 0 to maximum in an instant. The same survival response that had kept him alive when guerrilla warfare required immediate, overwhelming violence. Then, there was the numbness. Multiple accounts describe periods where Jesse seemed emotionally absent, disconnected from the people around him even, while physically present. His cousin wrote, in 1876, that Jesse could sit through family gatherings without seeming to register what was happening, staring at nothing, unreachable. Contemporary psychology recognizes this as dissociation, the mind's protective mechanism when emotions become too overwhelming to process. Jesse had spent years suppressing feelings that would have interfered with survival. The suppression had become automatic, leaving him unable to access emotion even when he wanted to. The alcohol dependence grew steadily worse. Associates documented Jesse's drinking increasing throughout the 1870s. What had started as self-medication after robberies became daily consumption, the only reliable way to quiet the racing thoughts and make sleep possible. The Kansas City Journal noted in 1877 that Jesse was rarely seen completely sober, though his tolerance was such that few recognized how much he was actually consuming. All of these symptoms, nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, dissociation, substance abuse, were being documented by people who had no framework for understanding what they were observing. They described Jesse as nervous, volatile, troubled. They attributed his behavior to personality flaws or moral weakness. Nobody recognized that they were watching a textbook presentation of what wouldn't be formally named for another century: post-traumatic stress disorder. Jesse James's body was keeping score of everything the war had done to him, recording it in racing heartbeats and sleepless nights, in rage that came from nowhere and numbness that made feeling anything else impossible. The symptoms weren't separate problems. They were all manifestations of a nervous system that had learned survival at the cost of everything that makes life worth living. And in 1877, with no treatment, no understanding, no language to even describe what was happening to him, the trajectory was pointing in only one direction: toward the violence that had shaped him, that sustained him, that would finally consume him. They documented everything except the thing that mattered most. The physicians of the 1870s were not incompetent. They were meticulous observers working within a theoretical framework that hadn't yet developed the concepts needed to understand psychological trauma. Medical journals from the period overflow with detailed case studies of veterans presenting with clusters of symptoms that defied conventional diagnosis. The doctors saw the suffering clearly. They measured racing pulses, documented sleep disruption, noted behavioral changes. What they couldn't see was that the organ being damaged wasn't the heart or the nerves in any physical sense. It was the mind itself. Dr. Jacob Mendez da Costa's work on irritable heart, published in 1867, became the dominant medical explanation for what ailed combat veterans. His theory proposed that the physical strain of military service damaged the heart muscle, creating a permanent state of cardiac irritability. The symptoms matched what doctors were observing: rapid heartbeat triggered by minimal exertion, chest pain, difficulty breathing, fatigue. Da Costa's explanation was logical, given 19th century medical knowledge. The heart was stressed during combat, therefore the heart sustained damage. The treatment followed naturally: complete rest to allow the damaged organ to recover. Veterans with severe cases were confined to bed rest for weeks or months. They were prohibited from physical activity, given sedatives to slow their racing hearts, told to avoid anything that might strain the damaged muscle. The treatment made intuitive sense. It was also almost certainly counterproductive. Modern understanding of trauma recovery emphasizes the importance of gradual re-engagement with normal activity, of processing experiences rather than avoiding them. Bed, rest, and sedation accomplished the opposite, leaving veterans isolated with their thoughts and no framework for making sense of what they'd endured. Other physicians proposed different explanations for similar symptom patterns. The diagnosis of nostalgia appeared frequently in medical literature from the 1860s and 70s. The term, derived from Greek roots meaning pain from returning home, described veterans who seemed unable to readjust to civilian life. They withdrew from social engagement, lost interest in activities they'd previously enjoyed, expressed feelings of profound disconnection from people and places that had once mattered to them. The prescribed treatment for nostalgia typically involved returning the veteran to familiar environments, surrounding them with family, re-establishing the routines of pre-war life. Again, the logic was sound within the medical framework of the time. The assumption was that reconnection with home would cure homesickness. What physicians didn't recognize was that these men weren't homesick for a place. They were fundamentally changed by experiences that made them feel alien in spaces that should have been familiar. The diagnosis of melancholia was applied to veterans displaying what modern psychiatry would recognize as depression: persistent low mood, loss of motivation, difficulty experiencing pleasure, sometimes accompanied by thoughts of self-harm. Treatments ranged from tonics and herbal remedies to electroshock therapy in more extreme cases. Some physicians advocated for fresh air and exercise. Others recommended complete isolation from stimulation. The most troubling diagnosis was moral insanity, a term applied to veterans whose behavior seemed to violate social and ethical norms without apparent remorse. This diagnosis was often given to men who engaged in violence, criminal activity, or behavior that seemed incompatible with their pre-war character. The implication was that military service had corrupted their moral sense, that the damage was fundamentally ethical rather than medical. Jesse James, had he sought treatment, would likely have received this particular diagnosis. His violence, his criminal activities, his apparent lack of conventional morality would have been interpreted as moral corruption rather than trauma response. The treatment for moral insanity in severe cases was often institutionalization in asylums where the morally defective could be separated from society. The asylum records from the 1870s reveal the fate of many veterans whose symptoms were too severe to hide. The Government Hospital for the Insane in Washington, known later as St. Elizabeth's, admitted hundreds of Civil War veterans in the decades following the conflict. Medical records describe men trapped in states of constant agitation, unable to sleep, prone to violent outbursts, tormented by memories they couldn't escape. The treatments were limited: sedation, physical restraint. When violent, isolation in rooms where they couldn't harm themselves or others. Some physicians began recognizing patterns that suggested the problem wasn't purely physical. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, a neurologist who'd treated numerous Civil War veterans, published observations in 1871, noting that many patients improved when given opportunities to discuss their experiences, when their suffering was validated rather than dismissed. His approach, which he termed rest cure, combined physical rest with what we might now recognize as early talk therapy. But Mitchell's insights didn't translate into widespread practice. Most physicians continued treating the symptoms as primarily physical problems requiring physical interventions. The psychological dimension remained largely invisible, not because doctors were blind, but because the conceptual framework for understanding trauma psychology wouldn't be developed for another century. The tragedy was this: 19th century physicians knew veterans were suffering. They documented the symptoms exhaustively. They proposed theories and attempted treatments. What they couldn't provide was the one thing that might have helped: understanding that the invisible wounds were real wounds, that the mind could be damaged just as surely as the body, that recovery required more than rest and sedation. Jesse James never entered a doctor's office complaining of soldier's heart. But thousands of other veterans did, seeking help for suffering that medicine could name, but not heal. They knew something was wrong. They just didn't know what to call it. Distance reveals what proximity obscures. Post-traumatic stress disorder entered the official medical lexicon in 1980, appearing for the first time in the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The recognition came after decades of advocacy by Vietnam veterans who'd returned from war carrying invisible wounds that the medical establishment struggled to acknowledge. The formal diagnosis provided what previous generations of traumatized soldiers had never possessed: a framework for understanding that psychological damage from combat was real, predictable, and treatable. But the condition itself was far older than its name. PTSD didn't suddenly appear in 1980. What appeared was the medical language to describe something that had existed as long as human beings had experienced trauma. The symptoms documented in Civil War veterans, in World War I shell shock cases, in World War II combat fatigue patients, were all manifestations of the same underlying neurological and psychological patterns. The human stress response system, when overwhelmed by experiences it cannot process, produces remarkably consistent effects across time, culture, and circumstance. Jesse James died in 1882, 98 years before PTSD received its official name. He never knew that what tormented him had another name, diagnosis, that his suffering followed predictable patterns, that treatment might have been possible. But looking backward through the lens of modern trauma psychology, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The diagnostic criteria for PTSD, as defined in the current DSM, require exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or violence. Jesse James's 2 years with Quantrill's Raiders provided sustained exposure to all three. Guerrilla warfare in Civil War Missouri meant witnessing violence, participating in it, living under constant threat of it. The exposure wasn't a single traumatic event, but prolonged immersion in an environment where death was routine and expected. The second criterion involves intrusive symptoms, unwanted memories, nightmares, flashbacks, intense psychological distress at reminders of the trauma. The historical record documents all of these in Jesse's life. His wife's letters describe the nightmares in detail. Newspaper accounts mention his violent reactions to unexpected sounds, his apparent reliving of combat experiences triggered by circumstances that reminded him of the war. These weren't character flaws. They were his brain, attempting to process experiences it couldn't fully integrate. The third criterion covers avoidance behaviors, efforts to avoid trauma-related thoughts, feelings, or external reminders. Jesse's constant movement from place to place, his refusal to discuss the war except with fellow veterans, his use of alcohol to suppress memories, all fit this pattern precisely. Modern trauma research recognizes avoidance as a primary coping mechanism, one that provides temporary relief while preventing the processing necessary for recovery. The fourth criterion addresses negative alterations in cognition and mood, inability to remember aspects of the trauma, persistent negative beliefs about oneself or the world, distorted blame, persistent negative emotional state, diminished interest in activities, feelings of detachment from others. Historical accounts document Jesse's emotional numbness, his isolation even from family members, his apparent inability to experience pleasure in ordinary life. His cousin's observation that he seemed unreachable during family gatherings matches this criterion exactly. The fifth criterion involves alterations in arousal and reactivity, irritability or aggressive behavior, reckless or self-destructive behavior, hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response, problems with concentration, sleep disturbance. Every single one of these symptoms appears in documented accounts of Jesse James's behavior. The violent outbursts, the gambling and drinking, the constant scanning for threats, the immediate explosive reaction to being startled, the chronic insomnia. The match isn't partial, it's complete. For a PTSD diagnosis, symptoms must persist for more than 1 month and cause significant impairment in functioning. Jesse James exhibited these symptoms from 1865 until his death 17 years later. The impairment to his functioning was total. He couldn't maintain employment, couldn't sustain intimate relationships, couldn't live in society without constant conflict. Dr. Jonathan Shea, a psychiatrist who worked extensively with Vietnam veterans, wrote in his 1994 book, Achilles in Vietnam, that combat trauma produces remarkably consistent patterns across historical periods. He compared ancient Greek accounts of warriors returning from the Trojan War to modern veteran experiences and found the same core symptoms: nightmares, rage, emotional deadening, inability to trust, sense of permanent alienation from civilian society. Jesse James would have met every diagnostic criterion for severe, chronic PTSD. Not metaphorically, not approximately, precisely. His documented symptoms align with modern clinical understanding so completely that a psychiatrist examining the historical record could make a confident retrospective diagnosis. The crucial framing is this. Today, we would recognize Jesse James as a combat veteran suffering from untreated PTSD. In 1876, he was simply a dangerous outlaw. The difference between those two interpretations isn't just semantic. It's the difference between understanding someone as damaged and understanding them as defective, between seeing trauma response and seeing moral failure. Jesse James didn't lack treatment because medicine hadn't advanced far enough. He lacked treatment because the very concept of psychological trauma from combat hadn't been integrated into medical understanding. The symptoms were documented exhaustively. The suffering was obvious. What was missing was the framework that would make healing possible. The diagnosis came a century too late to help him, but it arrived in time to help us understand what his life might teach us about the invisible wounds that outlive every war. Jesse James was 34 years old when he turned his back on the wrong man. April 3, 1882, began like dozens of other mornings in the small house on Lafayette Street in St. Joseph, Missouri. Jesse was living under the alias Thomas Howard, attempting another in a long series of fresh starts that never quite took. Robert Ford, a new gang member Jesse had recruited just months earlier, was staying in the house. The relationship was already fracturing. Jesse had grown suspicious, paranoid even by his own elevated standards, sensing betrayal, though he couldn't articulate from where. That morning, Jesse noticed a picture hanging crooked on the wall. He stood on a chair to straighten it. For perhaps the first time in 17 years, he removed his gun belt. Robert Ford, who'd been secretly negotiating with Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden for amnesty in exchange for Jesse's capture, saw the opportunity and took it. One shot to the back of the head. Jesse James died instantly, killed not in a dramatic shootout, but in a moment of ordinary domesticity, brought down by the very paranoia that had kept him alive for so long. He'd trusted Ford just enough to turn his back. That trust cost him everything. The newspapers that had romanticized Jesse's exploits now chronicled the pathetic circumstances of his death. The fearless outlaw killed while adjusting wall decoration. The legendary gunfighter shot by a member of his own gang, someone he'd considered almost family. The man who'd survived countless pursuits and gunfights ended by a single act of betrayal in his own home. The mythology couldn't survive the mundane reality of how it ended. But Jesse's death was only the most visible cost. The real tragedy lived in the accumulation of smaller destructions that his untreated trauma had caused over 17 years. His wife, Zerelda, survived him by nearly 40 years, but the marriage had been more endurance than partnership. Her letters, preserved in various archives, reveal a woman who loved a man she could never fully reach. She described living in constant uncertainty, never knowing which Jesse would come through the door, the charming husband or the violent stranger. She moved dozens of times, always under assumed names, raising children who barely knew their father's real identity. The psychological toll of that existence appears in her later correspondence. Anxiety, hypervigilance that mirrored Jesse's own, the sense that safety was always temporary. His children grew up knowing their father primarily through his absences and the fear that accompanied his rare presences. Jesse Edwards James, his son, spent his childhood learning to lie about his identity, to trust no one, to always be ready to leave everything behind. The intergenerational transmission of trauma wasn't a metaphor. It was daily lived reality. The same patterns Jesse had learned in guerrilla warfare, the hypervigilance and mistrust and readiness for violence, were being passed to the next generation through environment and modeling. Beyond his immediate family, Jesse's trajectory illuminated a broader pattern affecting thousands of Civil War veterans. The Government Hospital for the Insane admitted over 5,000 Civil War veterans between 1865 and 1900. Asylum records reveal men trapped in states of perpetual agitation, unable to reintegrate into society, their families unable to cope with behavior that swung between withdrawal and violence. Most died in institutions, forgotten by a nation that had moved past the war they couldn't escape. Suicide rates among Civil War veterans, though imperfectly documented, were significantly elevated compared to the general population. The fragmentary records that survive tell stories of men who'd survived combat only to succumb to despair years later. Newspaper obituaries from the period occasionally note that a veteran had taken his own life, usually with minimal detail. The shame attached to suicide meant many cases were likely concealed or misreported. Domestic violence, though rarely prosecuted in the 19th century, appears frequently in divorce proceedings and court records involving Civil War veterans. Women petitioning for divorce cited erratic behavior, violent outbursts, alcohol abuse, inability to provide stable homes. The legal language described moral failure. The underlying reality was often untreated trauma manifesting in destroyed families. Homelessness claimed many veterans who couldn't maintain employment or social connections. Urban centers in the 1880s and 90s had growing populations of war veterans living in poverty, often dealing with both physical and psychological war wounds. Contemporary social reformers documented these populations, but lacked frameworks for understanding that many weren't lazy or immoral, but were dealing with injuries that had no visible markers. The economic cost was calculable. Veterans unable to work, families destroyed, communities dealing with elevated crime rates, medical care for physical manifestations of psychological damage. But the human cost defied calculation. How do you measure the value of relationships that never formed because trust became impossible? How do you count the children who grew up afraid of their fathers? How do you quantify the potential that was lost when men were trapped in patterns established by adolescent trauma? Jesse James became famous. His name endured. But thousands of other Confederate and Union veterans lived and died in similar patterns of untreated trauma, their stories unrecorded, their suffering invisible to history. The cost of silence wasn't just individual. It was generational, communal, woven into the fabric of post-war American society in ways that remained unexamined for decades. Jesse James turned his back for one moment, but the real tragedy was that he'd been turning his back on healing for 17 years, choosing survival over recovery, because recovery wasn't offered, and he didn't know it was possible. By the time Robert Ford pulled the trigger, Jesse James had already been dying slowly for nearly 2 decades. Distance doesn't just provide perspective. It provides permission to see what was always there. More than a century has passed since Jesse James died on that April morning in 1882. Time has stripped away the mythology, the dime novel heroics, the romantic notions of the fearless outlaw. What remains, preserved in letters and medical journals and newspaper accounts, is something far more valuable than legend. It's a case study in what happens when trauma goes unrecognized, unnamed, and untreated. The story we've told ourselves about the American West needs revision. The frontier wasn't populated by men without fear. It was shaped by survivors carrying invisible wounds, by veterans whose nervous systems had been permanently altered by experiences their society had no framework for understanding. The gunslingers and outlaws, the men quick to violence and slow to trust, weren't manifestations of rugged individualism. Many were manifestations of untreated combat trauma, finding the only environment where their symptoms could be mistaken for strengths. Jesse James wasn't unique. He was simply the most famous example of a pattern that affected thousands. Confederate and Union veterans alike returned from the Civil War carrying psychological damage that manifested in nightmares, rage, emotional numbness, addiction, violence. The symptoms were identical across both sides because trauma doesn't respect political boundaries. The human stress response system breaks in predictable ways regardless of which uniform you wore. What makes Jesse's story significant isn't the robberies or the legend. It's that the documentation survived. His wife's letters describing sleepless nights, newspaper accounts noting his paranoia, medical journals cataloging symptoms in veterans that matched his behavior exactly. Gang members documenting his emotional volatility. Together, these fragments create a portrait detailed enough for retrospective diagnosis, clear enough to recognize the pattern. And recognizing the pattern matters profoundly because it connects past to present. Every veteran who came home from Vietnam carrying memories they couldn't speak about walked a path Jesse James had traveled a century earlier. Every soldier returning from Iraq or Afghanistan struggling with hypervigilance, with nightmares, with rage that comes from nowhere, is experiencing what Jesse experienced. The difference is that today we have language for it. We have treatment protocols. We have a societal framework, imperfect as it remains, that recognizes psychological wounds as real wounds, deserving of care. The formal recognition of PTSD in 1980 didn't create a new condition. It created the possibility of healing. It transformed what had been seen as moral weakness or character defect into something understandable, a predictable response to overwhelming trauma. That shift in understanding saved lives. It continues to save lives. Jesse James never had access to that understanding. He lived in an era when psychological trauma was attributed to damaged hearts or moral corruption, when treatment meant sedation or isolation, when veterans were told implicitly that their invisible wounds didn't count because the wounds couldn't be photographed. He survived the war only to spend 17 years being slowly destroyed by what the war had done to him. But his story, properly understood, offers something essential. It demolishes the myth that psychological trauma is weakness. Jesse James was not weak. He survived 2 years of guerrilla warfare as a teenager. He endured experiences that would have broken many adults. The fact that he developed PTSD wasn't failure. It was the inevitable result of sustained exposure to overwhelming threat during the formative period when his nervous system was still developing. His story also illustrates what silence costs. The inability to speak about trauma, to have it recognized and validated, extends the damage indefinitely. Jesse couldn't discuss his experiences without risking arrest. He had no community of fellow veterans who could normalize his symptoms. He had no framework for understanding that what he was experiencing was a predictable response rather than personal defect. The silence was as damaging as the original trauma. Today's veterans still face barriers to care, still encounter stigma, still sometimes struggle to get treatment they need. But the barriers are lower than they were. The language exists. The recognition exists. The possibility of recovery exists in ways it never did for Jesse James. The Old West wasn't built by fearless men. It was shaped by survivors, many of them broken, finding the only environment where their damage could be misread as strength. Some, like Jesse James, became legends. Most died in obscurity, their suffering invisible to history. But every one of them deserved better. They deserved recognition that their wounds were real. They deserved language to describe their suffering. They deserved treatment that might have transformed survival into recovery. Jesse James never got that chance. Understanding his story through the lens of trauma psychology doesn't excuse his violence or romanticize his crimes. It contextualizes them. It reveals the human cost of wars that don't end when the shooting stops. And it reminds us that today's veterans deserve what previous generations never received. The recognition that invisible wounds are still wounds. That psychological damage is real damage. And that healing is possible when trauma is finally named.